I was 34 when something happened at work that almost destroyed my life. It started on a normal Tuesday morning. My boss sent me a short message asking me to come to his office. I remember looking at the message and smiling to myself because, honestly, I thought it might finally be about the promotion I had been working toward. For the past year, I had been pushing myself harder than ever. I stayed late when projects were behind schedule. I covered shifts when people called in sick. I trained 2 new hires and took on responsibilities that technically weren't even part of my job. My performance reviews had been strong, and a few weeks earlier my supervisor had casually told me management was keeping an eye on my progress. So when I knocked on my boss's door that morning, I felt optimistic. But the moment I stepped inside, I knew something wasn't right. My boss was sitting behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. The HR manager was there too, sitting quietly with a thick folder in front of her. The atmosphere in the room felt tense in a way I couldn't explain. My boss gestured for me to sit down. I remember trying to stay relaxed, telling myself this was probably just a formal conversation about the future. But then my boss cleared his throat and said something that made my stomach drop. He asked me if I understood why HR was investigating me for harassment. For a second I thought he was joking. I actually laughed, waiting for someone else to laugh too. But nobody did. The HR manager opened the folder and began explaining that a formal complaint had been filed against me. According to the report, I had been making a female coworker uncomfortable for several weeks. She claimed I had been making inappropriate comments, standing too close to her during conversations, and sending messages that made her feel pressured. As she was talking, I just sat there in silence, trying to process what I was hearing, because none of it was true, not even close. When they told me who had filed the complaint, my confusion only grew. It was Emily. Emily had joined our company about 3 months earlier. She was 25, energetic, and new to the entire system we used. During her first week, I had been assigned to train her. I showed her how the workflow operated, introduced her to the team, and helped her understand the software we relied on every day. After that, we barely interacted. Maybe a quick question here and there if she ran into a technical issue. That was the extent of it. I explained all of this to them as calmly as I could. I told them there had to be some kind of misunderstanding. But the HR manager simply nodded in a careful, professional way and explained that they were required to investigate every complaint thoroughly. Until the investigation was finished, I would be placed on administrative leave. In other words, I was being sent home. Walking out of that building that afternoon felt surreal. Just a few hours earlier, I had walked in thinking my career was moving forward. Now I was leaving under the shadow of an accusation that could ruin my reputation. I had worked at that company for 5 years. My job wasn't just a paycheck. It was something I had built my life around. I had earned the trust of my coworkers, taken pride in my reliability, and slowly worked my way into a position of responsibility. And suddenly all of that felt like it was slipping away. The next few days were some of the most stressful days I've ever experienced. I kept replaying every conversation I'd ever had with Emily, trying to understand what could possibly have led to this. I went through emails, messages, and notes, searching for anything that might have been misinterpreted. But there was nothing. The only thing I remembered was that she had seemed a little distant during the last couple of weeks before the complaint. At the time, I assumed she was simply settling into the job or dealing with personal stress. Looking back, I realized something else had been happening during that same period. Emily had started working closely with another coworker named Jason. Jason and I had history. About a year earlier, both of us had been considered for an internal promotion. We had similar experience, similar performance records, and management had narrowed the decision down to the 2 of us. In the end, I got the position. Jason never openly complained about it, but the atmosphere between us changed after that. Conversations became shorter. Collaboration between our teams faded. It wasn't hostile exactly, but there was definitely tension. Still, I never imagined any of that had anything to do with what was happening now. About a week after I was sent home, HR contacted me for a formal interview. They asked detailed questions about my interactions with Emily. Where had we spoken? How often did we communicate? Had I ever contacted her outside of work systems? Were there witnesses to our conversations? I answered every question honestly. Fortunately, there was one important factor working in my favor. Most of the main workspace was covered by security cameras. Not private areas, of course, but hallways, workstations, and common spaces were all recorded. Since my job required me to spend a lot of time on the floor supervising operations, many of my interactions took place in those visible areas, which meant there was a record. The investigation lasted almost 3 weeks. 3 weeks where I barely slept. 3 weeks where I constantly imagined worst-case scenarios. I worried about my reputation, my career, and the possibility that even if the accusation wasn't proven, the damage might already be done. Then one afternoon, I finally received a call from HR asking me to come back into the office. Walking through those doors again felt incredibly uncomfortable. I couldn't shake the feeling that people were watching me, whispering about what they thought had happened. When I sat down in that same office again, the atmosphere was noticeably different. My boss looked relieved. The HR manager opened a file and explained that the investigation had been completed. They had reviewed security footage, internal messages, and interviewed multiple employees who had worked near us. What they found told a very different story than the complaint. Several of Emily's claims simply didn't match the evidence. For example, she had reported that one afternoon I cornered her in a hallway and made inappropriate comments. But the security footage showed something entirely different. It showed her approaching me to ask a question about a system error. The conversation lasted less than a minute, and 2 other employees walked past during that time. Nothing about it appeared unusual. As they continued reviewing evidence, more inconsistencies appeared. Eventually, the investigation uncovered something that explained everything. Emily and Jason had been seeing each other outside of work. Apparently, Jason had been telling her for weeks that I had unfairly taken the promotion that should have been his. At some point, the 2 of them began discussing a plan. If I were removed from the company, the position I held might reopen, and that was when the harassment complaint was filed. Once HR uncovered the relationship between them and reviewed the evidence, the situation changed quickly. The complaint against me was officially dismissed. Emily was terminated for filing a false report. Jason was also let go shortly afterward for his involvement. My boss apologized to me personally. He explained that the company had a responsibility to take every complaint seriously, but he admitted the situation had been incredibly unfair to me. Even after being cleared, returning to normal took time. For weeks I could feel the lingering tension in the office. Some coworkers avoided the subject entirely. Others quietly asked me what had actually happened. But eventually things settled down. Then, about 6 months later, something unexpected happened. The same management position that Jason and I had once competed for opened up again. This time there was no competition. My boss called me into his office and told me the role was mine if I wanted it. Of course, I accepted. Looking back now, the whole experience changed the way I see people at work. It taught me that a reputation can take years to build, but can be threatened by a single accusation. And even when the truth eventually comes out, the uncertainty in between can leave a lasting mark. I still believe most people are good, but I also learned that sometimes the people who smile at you every day might quietly be hoping you disappear. And that's a lesson I won't forget anytime soon.